Hello. The focus of this video is the media, so please make sure you read the assigned pages in the chapter before attempting any other written work for the week. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the media is and what we're talking about. So in this course in American government, when we talk about the media, we're talking about how people get their news. So the media is any form of mass communication that exists. It could be newspapers, it could be radio, it could be television, the internet, social media, magazines, all kinds of different ways in which people get information and news. And of course, those same media forms can also be used for entertainment or to get to follow sports programming and so forth. But in the context of this class, we're focused on the media as a way for people to get their news. Now, keep in mind that in the United States, we have the First Amendment to the Constitution, which basically protects freedom of the press. So news organizations, press organizations are free to report the news without censorship. That is a very fundamental part of our Constitution, and it does distinguish us from many other countries, even other democracies. The amount of press freedom that exists in the United States is much greater than it is even in other democratic nations. That isn't to say that those other countries have a lot of restrictions on the press. It's just that American reporters have a lot more freedom than reporters do, even in, say, Great Britain or other places. There are issues, for example, of libel and slander, which is when a news organization might say something or write something about a political figure that's false, and they do that with the intention of harming their reputation. In the United States, under Supreme Court rulings, it is very difficult to prove libel or slander against a news organization. The idea being that if we don't have freedom of the press, if we don't allow the media to report on stories, and they have to be fearful of being sued by political figures for libel or slander, they just simply won't report the news. That doesn't mean that news organizations should libel or slander. They should not be saying false things about a political figure or anyone else, but there is greater press freedom to ensure that news reporters can independently report the news without fear of being sued, or so that they really are reporting the news. Now, they do have an obligation. Reporters cannot report false things. They have an obligation to represent the public. They have an obligation to report fairly and accurately on what's going on. And that's why journalism schools exist. Colleges and universities train reporters. It's a professional occupation, so there are standards about how to report the news and what to include in a news article or in a broadcast, and how to fact check and check sources and that sort of thing. That isn't to say that reporters get it right all the time. Many times they don't. But news reporters are pretty fair overall in this country. Now, in terms of in terms of freedom of the press, again, also it means that the government may not censor the press either. That is, if a news reporter has a story they want to publish or release online or announce in a broadcast, they have the right to do that, even if it might embarrass a public figure, or it might be even information that the public figure doesn't want out, the elected official doesn't want people to know about. The only time the government can stop the release of a story is if they can demonstrate to a court that that publishing or releasing or announcing that story will endanger the security of the American people, national security. There was a very famous Supreme Court decision in the 1970s where the Supreme Court said the government cannot engage in what's called prior restraint. Prior restraint is when the government, we're talking here really about the federal government, although this could conceivably also involve state governments, but it's when the federal government tries to stop a news organization from releasing a story. So they're trying to stop it from even getting read or broadcast to the public. Again, the courts have said the only time that's allowable is when there's national security involved, and almost very few stories that the media might want to report would actually involve national security, where they would have information that could endanger the public. So the press does have broad freedom, and I think that's important. In terms of how people do get their news, there are a lot of ways in which to get news. Newspapers historically were the way people found out what was going on, going all the way back to the time of the founding of our country, the constitutional period when the Constitution was being adopted. Newspapers existed. Now, they were very partisan. That meant that they were favoring points of view, political party points of view, but they did exist in the 18th century. By the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, we began to move into a period of more objective news reporting in newspapers, which is the idea that newspapers would focus on the facts of a story rather than putting their opinions in the articles. And now the reality is that even today, newspapers obviously are not as popular as they once were because they have a lot of competition from newer forms of media. But newspapers don't always get it right. They do have to run corrections sometimes in the daily paper or online. And there's also the reality that some reporters' opinions can be found in a story, and so they try very very much to keep the stories neutral. But obviously, human beings are writing stories, and sometimes opinions may be might be able to determine that there was an opinion in there. But they do try very hard generally to get the stories right, accurate stories, and also to make sure they're objective. But of course, by the middle of the 20th century, by the 1950s and 60s, newspapers faced a lot of competition from television because television is a much easier way for people to get the news. In a way, it's more passive. You just sit and watch a television broadcast, a news program, rather than reading a story. And so by the 1960s, the end of the 1960s, a majority of people were reporting that they got their news more from more from television than from newspapers. Although newspapers were still pretty popular, but they were getting some of their stories from television, or more of their stories from television. In that time in the 1970s, let's say, by the time television had become the dominant way to get the news, there really were just the broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, along with public broadcasting. You didn't have cable networks quite yet. In the 80s, CNN was established as a 24-hour news station on cable, and by the mid-1990s, you had MSNBC and Fox News. And so now we have a whole range of choices for news coverage on television, and cable, and regular television. And that has changed the way news is covered because news stations have 24 hours a day to cover. And a lot of times they focus on stories that they can talk about, scandal, and what some people refer to as kind of a feeding frenzy, where they kind of feed on a story and sometimes blow it up into something more than it really should be. And then, of course, in the 90s, mid to late 90s and early 2000s, you had the internet. The internet became a way for news to be shared on websites, and all the news organizations, newspapers, and television stations, and cable networks, and so forth created websites where people could get the news directly from those sites. And that, of course, has really hurt newspapers, traditional paper newspapers, because by the time you pick it up off your doorstep in the morning, you probably have already read that story. It's been shown on their website. And so newspapers have gone through a lot of turmoil about how they make money. They have websites, but a lot of them have set up paywalls as a way to make money, so that you can get a certain number of articles for free, and if you want additional articles, you have to pay for them. And they make some money through that, but a lot of people just obviously will go for the free articles and not bother with the paid articles. And of course, there's a lot of advertising on newspaper websites. And then, of course, social media. Social media has really taken off really since the mid-2000s, 2005 to 2010. Facebook was obviously established. Twitter has become extremely popular with political figures as well as news organizations. It's a way to get quick stories or get quick information out to people. And a lot of people follow certain hashtags and certain stories regularly on Twitter. One of the downsides of social media, and in particular of something like Twitter and Facebook, is that a lot of false information can be more easily spread, not just true stories. Okay, in a newspaper in the traditional era, when you pick up a newspaper, the story had been written by a reporter. They had checked their sources. Sometimes they got things wrong, but usually they tried very hard to get them right. And so by the time you picked it up and read it in the morning, you could trust that the reporter made their best effort to get a true story to you. And the broadcast networks, if you were tuning in to CBS News in the evening, again, it was a half hour of news. The reporters had worked all day on those stories. The anchor would broadcast the stories, and you could trust that they had a pretty good idea of that the story was true. Again, it wasn't to say they didn't make mistakes, but generally they were broadcasting truthful information. The problem that exists on social media is that anyone who wants to can have their own Twitter account or their own Facebook account. And it can be a way to manipulate the news. And certainly, certain political figures are going to put out their own messages. And there's really no filter. People just get raw information from these figures on Twitter, on Facebook, and so forth. And it's not like the days when you had a news organization kind of filtering out inaccurate information. There's no filter on Facebook. There's no filter on Twitter. And so it can be very dangerous. We saw in 2016 the Russian government trying to influence the outcome of the election through different ways, through especially on Facebook, but also Twitter, through a lot of different technical mechanisms to try to manipulate people's ideas or thoughts on the election. And that, of course, continued in elections after 2016. And then, of course, in 2020 into 2021, you had political figures like the former president Donald Trump, who really made very active use of Twitter to get his message out in Donald Trump's case, but oftentimes the message he was putting out was false. One prime example of that was the election of 2020, which President Trump did lose to President Joe Biden, but he was denying the loss and saying that he had won in a landslide, and was putting out a lot of really false information on Twitter. And it wasn't until after the riot at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, that Twitter finally did shut down President Trump's Twitter account on the argument that it was dangerous to spread the false information on that way. And people can have differences of opinion about whether Twitter should have done that at the time. But it's definitely the case that the former president really was spreading inaccurate, false, and probably, I would say, in a lot of ways, dangerous information about what had happened in the election. He did lose the election; it was not fraudulent and so forth. But it points to the danger of social media. That again, there's no filter, and then of course millions of people retweet things, and it wasn't just former President Trump. It was also there are a number of conspiracy-oriented people on Twitter, and they can spread messages, and it can get very difficult to kind of figure out, okay, what's actually the truth. One thing I would say is if you are someone who is on Twitter, if you're on Facebook, if you're following social media, there is a way to fact check, or at least to understand, to determine whether something you're following is relatively either accurate and truthful, and that is to look at the source. If it's a regular news organization, CBS News, or a newspaper, the New York Times, or the Detroit Free Press, or whatever, if it's a news organization with a Twitter account, that information you can pretty much trust is pretty accurate. They're not spreading lies, they're not spreading false information. If they get something wrong, they retract it, they delete the tweet, or whatever. Where you get into trouble might be with an individual's website, and you can look at whose handle is it, whose Twitter handle, or whose Facebook account is it. Is it is it a news organization that's done some fact checking, or is it just a person who's putting their own views out there? So it's more challenging. There's a lot more information available on the internet and on social media, but there's also a lot of things out there that are not so good, and so you have to be a careful person, thinking very critically about what you're looking at. There are websites like Snopes.com where you can check to see if the story you've seen online actually really is true, or is an urban legend, that is something that's not true that people believe anyways. So there are ways to fact check stories. A lot of news organizations have fact checking articles and sites and so forth. So there is a way to do that, but you have to take the time, and sometimes people don't do that. But just wanted to talk a little bit about the media. Certainly, it's changed enormously and significantly over the last 25 years, particularly since the internet became so popular. Again, a lot more ways to get the news. You get news more quickly than you would have in the past, but there's also the danger of inaccurate or false information. And then one last thing I'll say is that, again, a lot of times people are critical of reporters, arguing that they're not telling the truth or that they're biased, which there is media bias that's discussed in Chapter 6, the idea that they might favor one point of view over another. But the reality is most reporters, the vast majority of them, are doing an honest job. They're doing their very best to get an accurate story out. They're not lying deliberately. If they make a mistake, they correct it once they realize they've made the mistake. That doesn't mean all reporters are good. That doesn't mean they're all right. And again, sometimes there are some bad reporters, but the vast majority are looking out for the public and just doing the job they were trained to do. So just always want to be careful that we don't attack reporters as being inaccurate or out with their own agendas. Again, most of them are just doing the job, a good job, an honest job, and occasionally they do make mistakes like we all do in our job. So it's very important to always remember that. So if you have any questions, please email me. Make sure you do any written work for the week, and take care.